Hello, my name is Christy, and here is my proposal presentation for my research project. So a quick overview of what kind of led me to decide on this project and some of the research behind it. So I am in my food service rotation right now at Harrison County Public Schools, and I'm shadowing Austin Dacey, the food service director at these schools. And so for my in-service assignment, I met with Jennifer Grouse, the culinary arts teacher, to talk about what I could do with her class. And she talked about with her students some of their challenges with food insecurity and access to healthy foods and fruits and vegetables. And one of the goals in her classes is to introduce new fruits and vegetables that are available to them and to teach these students how to cook these foods. So in their local Walmart, they had spaghetti squash. It happens to be one of my favorite vegetables. And so that's one thing I will be focusing on in this study. And so for my research, the CDC conducted a survey among rural high school students in Kentucky about lifestyle choices. And they found that 11% of students reported to never eat fruits and vegetables. And that's 7.3% higher than the national average for this question. So obviously there's some work to be done in Kentucky, and that is our job as dietitians, is to carry that load and to help increase this education and consumption of fruits and vegetables. So another thing that I came across in my research was different strategies for nutrition education. And one thing that I came across was to help improve perceptions of fruits and vegetables with the target population and increase self-efficacy, to increase their confidence in preparing the fruits and vegetables themselves. And those can be huge in actually seeing change after the education. And so those are a couple things I ran across in my research. And so the problem statement for my study is that lower fruit and vegetable intake contributes to higher rates of obesity and chronic disease among adolescents in rural Kentucky. The rates of fruits and vegetables among this population is low, and there appears to be both an environmental and educational factors that inhibit the consumption of fruits and vegetables among adolescents. So my objective and research questions. The objective of my study is to determine if an educational intervention with spaghetti squash can improve perception and consumption of spaghetti squash among adolescents. And so I chose to narrow down my research and my intervention to spaghetti squash. I wanted to choose one vegetable to focus on. And so my research questions: how do the students' preferences and perception of spaghetti squash change before and after the 2-day class intervention? And how did the students' self-efficacy of preparing a spaghetti squash dish differ before and after the intervention? So my hypothesis, I hypothesized that both self-efficacy and perception of spaghetti squash will improve with the intervention. And this goes along with research that supports improvement of consumption of healthy foods after a nutrition education and cooking demonstration. So the methods. My study is a longitudinal study, and the setting of the study, it will take place in Harrison County Public High School nutrition classes. So we chose to focus on the nutrition classes rather than the culinary classes because these students probably have a little less experience in the kitchen. And so I wanted to give them a little bit more of that with my classes. So my intervention is a 2-day class, including a carbohydrate lecture, a spaghetti squash demo where I am demonstrating how to cook it, and a hands-on spaghetti squash with the lab with the students themselves, where they can get hands-on and cook it themselves. So I taught a total of 8 of these 2-day classes, a total of 100 minutes of instructional time. So each day is a 50-minute class period. And so with 2 days, that's 100 minutes of instructional time. Okay, so the method of my data collection is a pre and post survey. So they take the pre-survey before the first class and the post-survey after the second class. And so a little bit of background on my study population. My population is high school students at Harrison County Public Schools, and most of them are between the ages of 14 and 18 years. About 95.2% are Caucasian, 2.3% African American, and 2.5% Hispanic or Latino. The approximate class size is 5 to 12 students, and this varied a lot because of the hybrid model of school. That's also why I taught so many classes. It's because there were A and B groups. The groups were broken up into Monday and Tuesday, and then Thursday and Friday when they were at school. So that's why the class sizes are smaller, and there were so many of them. But it did give a chance for a lot of different groups to be studied. And so my population is of a lower socioeconomic status as a whole. The entire school receives free lunch, and this is because over 60 of them qualify for free lunch and breakfast. And so none of the students have to pay because they over 50% qualify. The nutrition knowledge and experience before the intervention varied. Most have a very basic understanding of nutrition from the class. Jennifer's already taught them some about basic nutrition. Some have had more experience in the kitchen than others, so that varied a little bit, but most had a basic understanding of the basics of nutrition. So my intervention for day one, the first thing we did was a 5 to 10 minute pre-test. So they sat down and took that pre-survey. And then I did a 15-minute spaghetti sauce demo. So I demonstrated what they would be doing in the kitchen the next day during their lab. Then I conducted a 15 to 20-minute carbohydrate PowerPoint lecture, and I'll go over the content of that in a few minutes. And then we ended the class with a 5-minute spaghetti squash demo, so where they actually got to see the spaghetti squash itself being cooked. So day two, we started the day off with just a brief 5-minute instruction and safety review. And then most of that day was them in the lab actually cooking the sauce themselves. We couldn't have them cook the actual squash because it takes too long in the oven. It would have taken an entire class period to actually cook. But they got to see me do bits and pieces of cooking it. And then they got to end the class with taste testing the sauce they cooked with the squash. And then they took their post survey. And that was the end of the classes. So a little brief overview of the lectures that I gave. I started off with a brief review of the 6 major nutrients. We went over my plate and how sources of carbohydrates can be found in each of the my plate categories. I reviewed types of carbohydrates and how carbohydrates function in the body, and a comparison of your traditional pasta noodles to spaghetti squash. And this is just a few things I talked about. There's definitely more slides in my lecture. Here are some of the handouts I gave them for the recipes. They had these during class in the lab. They also were able to take these home just in case they wanted to make it later. Here are the surveys. So a brief overview, question 1, if they had eaten spaghetti squash before, and question 2, rate on a scale of 1 to 10, how much they liked the spaghetti squash. Question 3, rate on a scale of 1 to 10 on how confident they were in preparing the spaghetti squash themselves. And then question 4 was that for them to briefly state what they liked or disliked about it. And 5, whether they would cook the spaghetti squash at home or get someone else to cook it. So like if they would like to do it at home later. So the key variables for my study, the independent variable, since it's a longitudinal study, was the student participation in the class. My dependent variable was the change in perception and self-efficacy in preparing and enjoying the spaghetti squash, as shown by the surveys. And then for my data analysis, we talked about percentages for question 1 on both of the pre and post surveys, since that question 1 was different for the pre and post. And then questions 2 and 3, since it's continuous data, we'll use a t-test to interpret that data. And then a chi-square test will be used to interpret the categorical data from question number 5 on the surveys. So what is the value of this study to the dietetics profession? One of our biggest battles and one of our biggest goals as dietitians is to increase fruit and vegetable intake among whatever population we're working with. That's always a good thing. And so that's a big thing I wanted to focus on with my research project. And then almost all of us as dietitians will be involved in some level of education in our practice. And so maybe this study can help give some helpful strategies of what might be most effective in our education with a specific target audience. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you.